This is the second video in the portrait exercise. In this video, we are going to look at adding highlights and shadows to our base layer. I'm going to do the shadows first and then the highlights, but you can do them in whichever order you prefer. Okay, we're going to start by making a new layer above the face layer. And make sure you set it to be a clipping mask. And we'll change that to shadows, just so we can keep track of what it is. Then we're going to go to the paintbrush tool, and we need to set our opacity to about 25%. And we need to select a soft-edged brush. So you can either select one from the menu there, or use the shift bracket keys to make it softer. Then I want you to select your 75% gray from your palette. And then you're going to start painting in shadow areas onto this new layer. So keep an eye on your reference picture as you paint. Zooming in is helpful. You want to use a fairly large brush here. We are blocking in big areas of shadow. We're not worried about small details at this point. Don't worry about staying in the lines too much at this point. This is all about big areas of value. When you get to the areas that are especially dark, you can select your 100% black and darken up those areas. Now, as you paint, you're going to have to fight your impulse to want to get really detailed and specific, but that's not what you should do at this stage. And there's something that you can do to help this. I didn't actually do it until later on in this lesson, but if you take your original reference and you use a Gaussian blur filter, you can actually blur out all of the details of your reference so that you can really only see the values. And so your mind is going to be less distracted by individual details. I can actually see when I did this that there were areas around the eye that where dark values blended all together, and I hadn't done that yet. So even people who do this a lot can still benefit from this trick. Just remember to keep a copy of your original so that you have an unblurred version. Remember that once you start to create a new range of values on the portrait itself, you can sample values from there instead of using your palette to help blend areas or to create more subtle values. As you continue to add the shadows, you can shrink the brush and add some of the smaller areas of dark value in, but try not to do this too much because we'll get into this more in the refining stage. Okay, so once I find myself starting to get too much into the small details, I'm ready to consider the shadow layer done. And you can see what a difference that layer has made. Next, we're going to create a new layer above that one. We're going to make it a clipping mask, and we're going to call it Highlights. Then you're going to select your 25% gray and start painting in, on this new layer, anywhere on your reference that is lighter than average. Now I've found when I started painting with mine that I don't think my gray was actually 25%, I think it was more like 10. And so the contrast between it and the base layer was awfully bright. So what I did was just put down a couple layers and then selected that new color, which was a little bit darker and a little more faithful to the highlights of my reference picture. And then it's just a matter of trying to be as accurate to your reference picture as possible. I do recommend that blur trick. I think that would have helped out a lot here. You also have to be careful to fight your brain's impulse to tell you what it thinks should be there. This is especially true when you get to the eyes, because your brain will tell you that eyes should be white on either side of the iris, and that's simply not true in most pictures. So try to represent what is there. Don't let your brain tell you what it thinks should be there. So that's about as much detail as we're going to do in the highlight layer, and again you can see when you turn it on and off the difference that it makes. So that's step 2 and 3 finished for the face. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing for the hair. So we're going to make a new layer above the hair layer, create a clipping mask, we'll call it shadows, and we're going to paint in all the dark values of the hair. Again, blurring the reference image might help here so you don't get distracted by all the individual locks of hair. We're going for only big, blocky shapes at this point. As you're painting these shapes in, though, do try to follow the flow of the direction of the hair as much as you can, because then any brush strokes that show up will look like they're following the direction of the hair. And once you've got all the dark areas in, make a new layer for highlights, and you can put your highlights on that layer. Now there's not very many highlights in the hair because the hair doesn't have many bright values. And that is basically all there is to steps 2 and 3. Now by turning the material reference group on and off, you can see that we almost don't need the outlines anymore. It's starting to look more like a real painting and less like a drawing. So at this point, make sure that you save your work as a separate file.